Good morning and welcome to More Tea Minister. My name is Ian. Today we're going to do something a little bit different. As you can tell by looking at the table in front of me, I don't have the usual teapot and jug and cup and so on and so forth. And that's because we're not going to review a tea. Instead, I want to take one step backwards and think about why somebody might end up trying one particular tea rather than another. The reason why I discovered I enjoyed Taiwanese green oolongs, for example, sounds very sort of specific, but it's really just a matter of how you go down the rabbit hole and where you take a particular branch once you decide that you would like to learn a little bit more about tea. Now, I decided almost by accident that I would take more interest in tea. I'd had to give up smoking cigars, and cigars suited not just me because I enjoyed smoking them, but because there's a lot of detail about cigars, how to store them, how to age them, why choose cigars from one country over another, why choose a particular size of cigar over another, and that kind of suited my mentality. I'm firmly of the belief that a hobby isn't a hobby unless it involves an Excel spreadsheet. That's not an exaggeration, that's the way I work. Now, I had to give up on cigars and all forms of nicotine, and I was looking for something to fill that kind of mental gap in terms of a hobby. I'd recently been to a shop in York and picked a couple of teas just because I wanted to go in the shop because it smelled very interesting and I just wanted to pick up some things at random. And just the information on that shop's website about what I'd bought got me thinking, there's a lot to learn about here, there's a lot to think about, a lot to choose from. And so I decided that having given up cigars as an obsession, that tea would become an obsession. It then became fairly clear that there were lots of different types of tea to choose from: green tea, black tea, dark tea, purple tea, yellow tea, white tea, oolong. And I happened upon oolong tea because it sits somewhere between not quite green tea and not quite black tea. And I think that versatility is what first appealed. And then I discovered that Taiwan, although not the only country to produce oolongs, was famous for its production of oolongs. Not only that, I was struck by the fact that Taiwan is simply one place, and yet this one place could provide this absolutely bewildering variety of oolongs. I then discovered green oolongs, which I've reviewed on this channel already, and found it quite ironic that as much as I don't like green tea, you only have to tweak it or process it differently into a form of a green oolong, and suddenly it's something that I very much enjoy. However, as you can see from the variety of packets that we have on our table in front of us, green oolongs aren't the only kind of oolong that you can find. So today what I'm going to assume is that somebody has come down the rabbit hole of tea with me as far as oolongs, together with branched off into the oolongs of Taiwan, and now we're faced with all the choices that leaves us with, and how do we decide where we might go from here? Just looking at the products that we have in front of us, you'll find lots of different names. This is the first thing that somebody would notice. So you have here with this one, Yingxing. We have over here, Competition Muja Tie Guan Yin. Right in front of me, Acacia Charcoal Roast Oolong. Next to that is another charcoal roast oolong. On the other side, a limited edition charcoal roasted High Mountain oolong. So you'll find lots of different names. There's over here Mei Shan, using a Jin Xuan cultivar. There's Baozhong, there's Guanyin to go with the Tie Guanyin. Over here we have a Gui Fi oolong. We have Dongding, Heritage Wu Yi, and Shui Xian. How do we make sense out of all of that? There were not only lots of different names, but there were also some words that are repeated. There's at least three three teas here that are charcoal roasted. So how do we have the same name but with a slightly different context? Well, to do that, we're going to try and explain what these names have in common, what they are trying to tell us. So the first thing we're going to do is think about region, locality, place. Taiwan is only one place, but if anybody visits Taiwan, I've never been, or anybody who lives there, they'll be very keenly aware that Taiwan isn't one sort of uniform place. It has regions, it has locales, it has its towns, it has its cities, it has its rural areas, its urbanized areas. And tea is grown in different locales throughout Taiwan. In fact, when it comes down to tea at the, how can I put this, the boutique level, you're talking about tea that you can trace to one particular farm. So you could get various teas from a very specific location if you could get them from different farms. And the point being is that each region has a different soil, a different climate, in some cases a different altitude, and all of that will affect the tea differently. In fact, certain teas will grow better at certain altitudes. Or you could take the same tea, the same cultivar, more about that later, and grow that at one altitude and have a very different crop and growing it at a different altitude. So let's start with this tea here. This is from Taiwan, Mei Shan. It's also a particular cultivar, but leave that to one side. Mei Shan. Shan means mountain. So we know that we're dealing with a high altitude oolong from Taiwan. Now the problem is, it's not really a problem I suppose, but some of these have a very high cachet, especially the high altitude ones. So some of them are in a very high price bracket, a little bit too pricey for my pocket, but it's perfectly possible to get high altitude Taiwan oolong such as Ali Shan and here Mei Shan without breaking the budget. So you can try a high altitude oolong without breaking the bucket, without breaking the bank. Also for this charcoal roasted one here, this is Shan Li Shi, another very famous tea growing region of Taiwan. So it might be possible, and I know for a fact it is, to get, in this case, charcoal roasted tea from Shan Li Shi, but also tea that hasn't been roasted at all. So there's plenty of choice. And by looking around at some of these others, this one's from the region of Taoyuan. This one is from Nantou County. And in fact, all three of these here are from Nantou. The point being is, one of the ways to navigate further down the rabbit hole is by picking a particular area and then saying, what kind of teas can I find coming from that area? And you will find that although there's still a huge amount of variety, at the very least, you've ticked off one variable. That's all we're really trying to do. How do you narrow down the choice or the focus so that the reason why you've picked one tea over another is a meaningful choice? It's not purely at random. And effectively, it is random unless you've got some experience and some reason for picking one thing over another. At least the way my mind works, that's how we go. So one way to think about it is to think about the region. Another way is to pick on a particular cultivar of tea. One of our early videos was on spring jasper. That's the spring harvest of an oolong from Taiwan called jasper. Jasper being a particular cultivar. And Taiwan is famous for a number of other cultivars. We have here, just as one example, one of its most famous ones is Jin Chuan, because that is the cultivar used for milk oolong, which has nothing to do with the taste of milk, but it's to do with the mouthfeel of milk or cream, and that comes from the Jin Chuan cultivar. Ironically, you can have Jin Chuan in a more oxidized form. This is oxidized to 45%, but also this high altitude Mei Shan Jin Chuan is a much lower oxidation. It's a fairly typical green oolong. So if you pick one cultivar, you can have it high altitude, lower altitude. You can have it roasted or unroasted. You can have it more or less oxidized. And these are all things or from different areas as well. So you might decide to pick on a particular region or go with a different cultivar. I've got various cultivars represented here. We've got Jinshuan, as I say. We've got a heritage Wu Yi oolong. We've got here what's known as Xiji Chun, 4 seasons, very often associated with green oolongs. But the point is you can pick one cultivar, one named kind of tea, and find the different places it's grown in and how that affects the tea as well as also how it's processed. We might also look at some names that recur over and over in Taiwanese oolong. So we have here Muzha Tie Guan Yin. Over here I have Dong Ding, which is a lovely name. And here we have Gui Fei oolong. These are just 3 examples of styles of Taiwanese oolong. So let's start with Gui Fei. That comes in different guises in different countries as well, but it boils down to what we call a bug-bitten oolong or bug-bitten tea, because it doesn't have to be oolong. And what happens is that to produce a bug-bitten oolong is to rely on a different kind of biochemistry within the leaves of a tea plant. In one of our early videos, we discussed that when you damage a tea leaf or you bruise it, you initiate the process of oxidation. And it goes from being a pristine green tea leaf ultimately to an example of a leaf of black tea or red tea. Bug-bitten tea takes a very different kind of biochemistry. Essentially, when the tea leaves are bitten by an insect, and it can be a grasshopper, it can be a kind of green fly, it varies in different places. The tea leaves react to those insect bites by producing chemicals. And the long and the short of it is, after you process those tea leaves, you find that those chemicals that the tea leaves have released have provided a lovely honey flavor. It can be quite complex, but it boils down to a honey flavor, which is why this example is called Honey Duchess. Now, the beauty is that you can find these in different countries, in different names as well. But this is a style, bug-bitten, Gui Fei, Oriental Beauty, oolong. So it's possible to find lots of different examples of that from different places. And again, you can have a bit of choice, a bit of variety, but you've narrowed it down. What else did we have in the way of styles? Yes, we've got over here, from Taiwan, a Bao Zhong. Now, what does that mean? Bao Zhong is effectively a style in that it's the least oxidized green oolong. If you find that you want to try green oolong, something very close to green tea, well, you can push it as hard as possible and go for this minimally oxidized Bao Zhong. And there are various ones from different places. Wenshan is a very noted one. But the point is, that's another way to narrow it down, trying minimally oxidized green oolongs. And taking things to a different kind of style, we have here Tie Guan Yin Muzha. Now, Tie Guan Yin is an example of a tea with a different kind of story. Tie Guan Yin is technically a kind of tea, but in Taiwan, it's now become a style. It's become associated originally with very heavily oxidized and roasted tea, but now with greener teas. Muzha is the place where the Tie Guan Yin tea was first grown in Taiwan, and now, although it's not technically that particular cultivar, it is in fact Jinshuan, our old friend we've already mentioned. It's a style of tea. You can narrow it down. I've got a huge block of Tie Guan Yin here as well. So you can find a little bit of variety from Tie Guan Yin, which is really about style as opposed to cultivar, and you can find lots of different farmers producing it as well. And finally, along those lines, we have Dong Ding. Dong Ding originally was purely a geographical location. Dongding is a mountain, it means frozen summit. And it was the location where the first high altitude tea was grown in Taiwan, I believe. However, tea is grown at higher altitudes and in other high altitude locations now. Originally, Dongding was a green oolong. However, over time, farmers got fed up of not being able to completely sell 1 year's harvest before the next harvest came along. And a green oolong, unless treated carefully, it doesn't last forever. And so the farmers decided that they would start to roast some of their tea. Roasting it preserves the shelf life of the tea because it dries it out a bit, but it also, as we'll see in a moment, adds to the flavor profile of the tea. But the point being is Dongding is a style because you'll find Dongding tea that doesn't technically come from, well, that mountain, that area Dongding, but it's not really cheating because if you think in terms of style rather than purely a cultivar of tea or a region, then once again, you get plenty of variety, but you have a reason for picking one thing over another. So let's talk about two different ways to narrow down our selection of tea. First of all, we have oxidation. Oolongs can be green oolongs, such as the Meishan here, or the Baozhong here. They can also be very heavily oxidized. So instead of being green oolongs, they're now red oolongs. They're much closer to black tea. Now, I don't particularly enjoy the heavily oxidized oolongs. I don't find that flavor profile is as satisfying as a straightforward black tea. So I don't have here anything that is a red oolong for the sake of it. However, in some instances, oolongs are roasted. I beg your pardon, oolongs are more heavily oxidized before they are roasted, which is the point we're going to talk about next. Not all oolongs are heavily oxidized before they're roasted because the roasting is there to, as I say, preserve the tea or to change its flavor profile, or in some instances to lock in the flavor profile of that tea to actually make it more intense. But in some instances, as in the case of this acacia charcoal roasted oolong, the oxidation has been bumped up, in this case to 45%, before it's been roasted. Now you'll find oxidation levels can take place, well, at various levels. It can be a percentage, it can be a numerical value. It can be light, it can be medium, it can be heavy, it can be charcoal roasted. Now I think by the time you get to charcoal roasting, you're almost looking at a different style because you are imparting to some extent that charcoal quality, although it never overshadows the tea itself. So you can say, right, I am going to focus on light roasted oolongs. Again, plenty of choice. You might go with medium or heavy roast. The beauty is that in doing so, you can start to be looking at teas from different locations, or in this case, and this is a very interesting one for me, roasted 3U. Now that's cultivar. Cultivar usually associated with minimally processed green oolongs, and yet all of a sudden, by roasting it, you have a completely different product. It's also from this very specific region. It's from the Songboling area of Taiwan, and it's 400 meters, so it's not exactly ultra high altitude either. So just by narrowing things down to region or cultivar or style or the oxidation level or the level of roasting, and that can be none whatsoever, you're taking what is still this bewildering variety and you're starting to narrow it down. But in the act of narrowing it down, you're able to say to yourself, okay, I've narrowed it down to, for example, Dongding. But there were lots of different farmers producing Dongding. It's roasted to different levels. So this one is particularly interesting to me because it's custom baked. It's not simply Dongding at some random level of roasting. The vendor was able to say, we want this level, to be able to sell. And you find that in different vendors as well. That leaves me, just going to take a small drink of water, excuse me. Ironically not tea. And that leaves me talking about one final kind of way to narrow your selection of Taiwanese oolong down. And that's the question of crossovers. I already mentioned with this Guifei bug-bitten tea, you can find it in different countries now. I've had honey oolong bug-bitten tea from China. I've had it from Darjeeling. So you find that teas are being produced in different countries to kind of provide parallels or analogues for teas of styles or cultivars from different countries. Taiwan is no different. So we have here a heritage Wu Yi oolong. The name Wu Yi oolong is much more associated with China, but there is a heritage strain of it to be found in Taiwan. So if you want to know what happens to a Wu Yi oolong when it's grown, produced and processed in China, you can do that. Or you can have a much more classic example of a analog, this attempt to crossover with a tea like this, which is Taiwanese Shui Xian. Now, Shui Xian is a cultivar associated with China. It's the water sprite, the narcissus. However, rather than growing that cultivar of tea in Taiwan, the growers here decided that they would take a very well-known Taiwanese cultivar, the Four Seasons Shiji Chun, and by the level of oxidation and roasting it to produce something that isn't Shui Xian. No one's pretending it is, but it's an homage, it's an analog, it's the attempt to recreate something of that same tea in a different country and with a different cultivar and different production circumstances. So I'm aware that this has been me talking for, heavens, 22 minutes solidly so far. Hopefully I'll narrow that down. In the description box, I'll provide these kind of variables that I've been looking at. But the point is this: you can be paralyzed by choice. How on earth would you decide what kind of tea you would like to try, even if you've narrowed down the type of tea to oolongs, even if you've narrowed it down to one particular place, Taiwan, you're still faced by this bewildering choice. And you have to be able to make a meaningful choice, or at least, to my mind, you have to make a meaningful choice. Why this tea over that tea? Quite literally, on the shelf or on the website, rather why A and not B? And if it's going to be a meaningful choice, you have to think about the things we've been talking about: the region, the terroir, the style. Is it crossover? What's the cultivar? How oxidized is that tea? Has it been roasted or otherwise? And in so doing, you're tapping into the only way I believe that you can decide, make some choices, and by picking one particular variable, it still opens up some choice for you, some variables, some possibilities, but at least you've narrowed it down. Anyway, that's quite enough of me talking. As always, I hope that this has been of some use. With me talking for so long, I don't think I can hope that it's been that interesting. So all that remains for me to do is to say happy steeping and God bless.